All right, if you want to take your seats, we'll get started with our next session. So we have a little fireside chat for you today. And I'm very pleased to welcome Matthew Dunn, who's the Secure Authentication Architecture and Technology Engineering at Citi, and Rakesh Loonkar, who's president and co-founder of Transmit Security. And they will be chatting about how Citi has rolled out Passwordless to 200 million banking clients in 160 countries. And I can't wait to hear how you did that. So,
great.
Take it away.
Just to correct one thing, it's present tense and future tense as opposed to past tense. First of all, Matthew, thank you so much for doing this, and really appreciate. This is also being webcast. So for everyone on the webcast, nice to see you or nice to meet you. FIDO fans, I'm going to introduce you to FIDO Rockstar. Matt, at Citi, you're responsible for Citi and the strategies around global identity and anti-fraud. You're also responsible for employee identity and customer-facing, which are two completely different worlds and subjects. But today we're going to be focused on customer-facing. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, so let's go right into it. So, Citibank going passwordless, of course, using FIDO and across 200 million users, 180 countries. By the way, that's very, very difficult because you're operating in 180 different regulatory regimes in many cases. It's a big bet on passwordless WebAuthn and FIDO. In fact, you're probably one of the largest customer implementations of FIDO ever that at least I know about. So I'm going to just start with the basic. Why are you doing this? Why passwordless?
Yeah. So when we think about passwordless, and we've been working very closely with our fraud teams, it's not hard when we're talking to businesses and we're looking at our clients, which is where we started. To see the friction, the difficulty, right? You still want to make passwords more secure, but you can't do it in a meaningful way. And the reason you're doing passwords, and we have been doing it for so long, is because we are held hostage to the keyboard being the interface that you would type or use in order to interact with the system. So, when people say passwordless, what really we're thinking about is extending our lens into capabilities that are in the system level, where you can get out of the interaction with the client where they have to provide something to you that they know or that you gave them to regurgitate to you to prove that you think that how they're coming back in is supposed to be them. We want the systems themselves to kind of have that information. So you get a bigger lens in terms of the analytics, the information on the back end, and not just a single lens. We want to look across the whole session of the user. So authentication is just one lens, and when you have a little bit more information about the user, you can actually expand that. So passwordless gives you that.
So you love passwords?
No,
I'm kidding. So, everybody knows going passwordless is just a flip of the switch. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
It's a pretty significant technical challenge. Both with the legacy environment that you have, as well as really supporting the untrusted environments of customers with different types of apps that really literally process trillions and trillions of dollars of money flow. If you were to kind of enumerate what you think your top challenges were, your system challenges, trying to go passwordless, how would you articulate that to this group?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is if you look at technology, there's still a lot of legacy technology and backend hooks that have credentials and passwords associated with access control. So when you're looking at those facets, you have to be very strategic in terms of how you're going to tackle this. For our clients, the first thing to do was to determine strategically what made the most sense. How were we going to extend into intuitive capabilities they had that were secure and kind of met the requirements that we thought from a business level that would kind of pivot the market. So we led heavily with looking and working very closely with our businesses to take a look at their applications, their architecture, and think about how to transition. And so when we did that, we kind of identified there's a lot of different things you can do. And you can't go big bang. You have to support what you currently have, and you have to iterate, and you have to kind of tell your own journey for the users where they get to kind of continue to get better, but choose which chapter of the page they want to go, offering different capabilities. So I think the biggest thing for us was to understand strategically where to go, the limitations in the market and the architecture and where they were going, where the open standards and capabilities such as FIDO are, and what that means for us in terms of our risk, our liability, and kind of how to work with our business to shrink that gray area and have a better understanding of what's green and what's red at the end of the day. So we worked very closely with the fraud team and our business teams on this strategy.
That's very interesting. And how did you pick the first set of applications? You have, I think, more than 800 applications of various different types. What came first and why? Or whatever you can tell us.
We were looking at a lot of things in terms of the cost to run the iterative process that we had to do for new authentication implementations that our business was looking at, and historically how we kind of pivoted in that back end. So we really focused on a business that was digitally ready with their capabilities and funding to move forward, and that had the most interest from a market perspective, because we're global, that we would get the most traction with them. So we chose a very large business. We worked very closely with our innovation lab, and we kind of determined what would make the most sense based on which business unit felt that they could get the most traction. And there was a huge save on the back end that we kind of illustrated at the beginning. Because if we continued doing what we were doing, we could show that cost profile with the growth of the business and the users. And we were able to actually give them a kind of comparative analysis is if they shifted now as compared to 3 years from now, not only would they get better capabilities with their users, and we didn't even bring in the expectation that user population would grow because it's even a better product, but they would save money just from shifting their lens from what we were doing to the new stuff that was coming out.
So I think that's actually a really important point. So you're using FIDO to save money with the business, and the business was willing to fund that. And did you use that to help convince the business, or what was the challenge in convincing that business, or was it easy?
It's interesting in this space. Like we're security experts, so what we want to do is go to them and say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. It's insecure, and that's why we have to do it, right? And I've been doing this long enough, and that playbook doesn't really work, right? Because from their perspective, they understand there's risks, but there's a calculated risk that everybody's willing to take in order to work in this sector. And if you go to them and say, you have to do this because there's a security issue, they're going to say, well, what's the likelihood? How big is it? Do we think it's going to actually happen? And usually, if you don't have good enough information there, they don't do it, and then they come running to you after it actually happened to them, right? And so we didn't go after them from, hey, this is good from a security perspective. We went at it and said, hey, the user experience isn't great. And if we change the user experience with some new capabilities, not only does it improve the user experience, it increases the security, or actually it reduces the friction, makes it easier for your users, and it's going to cost you less to run than what you were previously throwing into previous technologies that you were supporting to do additional steps of security for the users, such as like shipping out tokens to how many millions of users because we deemed that SMS wasn't secure enough for some high financial institutions, and there's a cost associated with that. And if you're doing something less cost than that, more secure and less friction, it's an easier sell than to try to convince them there's a security issue, and that's why they need to spend money.
And I think that's a great message for an economy with a pending recession, where we're all challenged to bring investments to the business that yield value, both in terms of customer experience and cost savings. Now, as you went through this passwordless journey, you own both employee and customer, and you started with customer first. And I hear a lot of enterprises who want to start with employee first. Why did you pick the customer-facing environment first? Sometimes a lot of people say they don't want to deal with the business and they don't want to cross these lines. But the nature of using FIDO and doing password replacement for employees and customers is also completely different. Can you talk to us about why you picked customer-facing first?
Yes.
Is it because you like the hardest problems first?
Yeah. No, it's actually
You're a masochist?
It's actually the reverse if you think about it. So like, yeah, we have more customers. So you would think the problem is more difficult. But really, if you think of from an employee perspective, an employee has more credentials and more access to internal systems than a customer does, right? So there's a different control plane there. And when you go to customers first, there's an immediate value to the business that can be achieved in a very quick way. Employees, there's a lot of back-end technologies that's still legacy, still in the back end, that have limitations in terms of removing credentials because they're still core into the back-end directory structures, or don't have the ability to transform, or I have employees that aren't allowed to have their phones at their desks, and how are they supposed to operate in this new model? So for the customers, it's a lot easier because you're kind of expanding the business in a meaningful way, the business values right away, and then you use that to secure the internal access points for employees from compromise. One has an immediate that actually then justifies, and once you see the customers, and we actually did this, we said, look at the award-winning items that we're doing out in the market, and we want to now do that internally. And it was an easier conversation because the businesses saw all the feedback from our clients about how great this was. And they're also clients at the end of the day too, so they saw it. So then they started asking questions. Hey, why aren't we doing this internally? And then that gets that ball rolling. But it's a lot more moving parts and pieces for employees, for the ecosystem and architecture that they run into, as opposed to the customer-facing, where you can take different aspects of different business lines and start iterating and changing those and then transforming and continuing that track.
Thank you, Matt. And now, in this project, you decided to use a vendor. And you decided, and by the way, thank you. You decided to use Transmit Security. Many end users, application owners, large, think they can build on top of WebAuthn and passkeys by themselves. You decided to not build it yourselves, even though you have the scale and capability of Citibank, and I know the bank likes to build a lot of things themselves. Why did you choose a vendor, and specifically Transmit, to help you on this journey?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Anybody potentially can try to build this stuff. And when you step back, we have a lot of things that we built, and we have some patented items. But we've done it only in places where there weren't products in the market available for those things that we've identified. When there's something in the market, I am not a software development shop. Our mission statement at Citi is not to build software and sell it. It is to bank, right? To invest. They're trying to justify the budget to build and then continue to justify that budget and iterate on it and keep up with the market is challenging. And the flip side of it, when I think about this, is when you're working with a vendor that's strategic and that's their core mission statement, and they have other clients and partners that are working with their product. If I try to build it, I have one lens in terms of how I see this technology, this architecture, this solution, and this value. And I'm limited by that. When I'm using a vendor product, there's a bunch of other people that have some insight and some ideas of how to see this product progress, how they see the market and the technology progressing. And so you kind of limit yourself to your own capabilities and understanding when you're doing it yourself, as opposed to partnered with a vendor where strategically they're there and there's other companies also partnered with them, that they're going to help also make that product better. And they're going to have ideas that you didn't have that you're going to get benefits out of. So that's kind of how I think of it when I look at whether I'm going to build something internally, as opposed to partner with a very strong vendor that we know is resilient in the market, and we know that there's a value there, and there's growth potential and capabilities. I mean, that's the deciding factor for me.
And you also did something. You have a very, very large legacy environment.
Mm-hmm.
You have an IDP that you've been using for many, many years, probably more than a decade. And that vendor has both WebAuthn and FIDO certified implementation on top of the IDP, as well as a cloud service. But yet you decided to use a different vendor and plug that into your IDP.
That's correct.
Now, can you talk about why did you decide to plug in a separate FIDO passwordless service into your legacy IDP vendor, and let's call that a vendor that has a four-letter that's a four-letter word.
Yeah. So
That could be many vendors.
Every time I look at this, it's one of those things, and I've been to a lot of different business meetings, and sometimes I've been in some, and the business says, well, this vendor is willing to give us all these things at this price, so we want to move along with them. And we take a look at those things and we say, that's interesting. They're not top of market in those products. So you're paying a lot of money for a lot of stuff that's not best of breed. And I think of it kind of like building a stereo, right? When I want a stereo, I'm not going to go just buy a Sony stereo and all the components are Sony, right? Because Sony's good at certain things, Denon's good at certain things, BMW's good at certain things, and we're engineering, right? We make all these products seamlessly integrate behind the scenes. So what we want is the best of breed that has the most flexibility, that is robust to our demands, has the most automation, and sometimes we have multiple vendors and multiple products, and some of them have different strategies in terms of where they're going and where they're investing as opposed to other ones. And at the end of the day, we want to align the ones that have the best capabilities and growth, and that's their market and their direction, with other ones that also have the capabilities, but they're kind of going in a different direction, right? They're kind of looking at different aspects of identity and credential stores or directory structures or services at that end of the day. So I always think I want the best of breed. And from an engineering perspective, we make things that shouldn't work together behind the scenes, which is the challenge. But we do it, and we do a very good job of making sure that we do it the right way, that there's no impact, there's no understanding from the business why it has to be a certain thing. They just know the capabilities they get at the end of the day. So you just want the best at what you're trying to do in that facet, and not, and I always say when you're talking to vendors or you're talking to a product, you got to make sure strategically your architecture and where they're going matches what you're doing. It's going to be a waste of everybody's time if we're trying to transition to be something we both, like I want you to be and you don't see it. Spending that time and investment is not going to make sense because you're going to lose out on the other side. So we're very realistic when we're talking to people in terms of our expectations and where we see them. If we're aligned and we're on the same page, then we're good. And if not, then it's better to be in a partnership with a vendor or a product team that is aligned to where you think or have to go and that matches your architecture. Right? We're very big and complex, so it doesn't fit everywhere. But if it fits, I always say, if you can do it for us, you can do it for anybody in this market. So.
And I would say you're pretty brutally honest with vendors, being on the other side of that many times. Now, Matt, different question about vendors and just kind of DNA of vendors. There are really vendors coming at Passwordless and FIDO with their identity chops and bones, and being great at single sign-on and governance and directory, and then there's another set of vendors coming at it from like a real anti-fraud risk, kind of background. Which company DNA do you think resonates with you more to help solve the passwordless, the technical set of problems around passwordless?
I would say the fraud side of the house, specifically because everybody's going to start hearing zero trust for identity. It's starting to get traction in the market, and what you really have to think is not one facet of access that is the security. You have to think about the whole session across the various systems, APIs and systems behind the scene. So you need to have the data analytics on the back end. You need to plug very closely with the fraud team so you have your ability to protect your assets. So if we're thinking single sign-on and passwordless, if you're looking at something like FIDO and you're just looking for to do an enrollment with a password to enable something like a FIDO element so that the device can be used as opposed to a password, great. That thing is as strong as your password, right? That's all it is. Somebody compromises a password, somebody else can and set up their device to do the same thing. It could be stronger than that. You have to think more than just passwordless. You have to think, if we're on this trajectory, can I get more without adding a lot more friction and overhead at the end of the day? And you can. So you might as well go MFA and plug that into the fraud analytics and back-end decisioning engines as well. So you have the ability to expand so that you can monitor throughout the whole session to protect yourself in a better way than just that multiple assets where you have to plug it in and then do checks if it's still good, or if you think it's bad, then question them again, right? So that's kind of how I look at it.
Now, that's really interesting. And, just kind of final question. I know it's really early, and late in the day.
Yeah.
But there's quite a bit of promise and discussion about passkeys. From a banking perspective, what's your perspective? And then to be controversial, I'm going to ask you: do you think the large platform vendors are going to really be able to work with each other?
I hear it. I don't see it, because if I really look at the vendors of the OS and the platforms in the large competitive market, there's a competitive advantage that they have. Like Apple is not, its market isn't, our devices are intuitive and easy to use and elegant. And they're secure. And you can connect your identity across them. And to say, great, now I have a Surface. I want you to enable us to share that. I mean, they're not going to make it easy, and there's definitely a competitive edge I see in the industry that's important to them to keep control of that, because that has a direct impact on their market share.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. I think, do we have time for questions? Or
We do have time for a couple questions. I actually have a few in the app that I'd love to ask you, Matt.
Okay.
With regard to a rollout of this scale, how do you look at, it's kind of a two-parter.
Sure.
Where do you start in terms of pinpointing where you want to pick your customer base that you're trying to start with? Is it by geo? Is it geo plus a profile? And then I'll ask the other part just so that you have it all. The other part is, and it's another question in the app, but it's semi-related. Is the plan to get to a place where you're taking the password off the server entirely?
Okay, so good. So actually, you have to take in geographic regions into your calculations in terms of where you think you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Like if you're working in Mexico and you're looking at the devices that the individuals are using there, even if you tried to move there significantly, you'd have better traction and adoption and capabilities in the North America region than a Latin America region, just because the devices, right? That's definitely changed in the last couple of years. I think the posture in terms of individuals down in different regions and the devices they have that have the capabilities that really would align to a strategy such as FIDO is transforming. But I think you have to be very, if you're like we are and you're in multiple regions, you really have to take into account those regions and those customers. If I look at certain regions, some customers very heavily adopt biometrics, face biometrics. It's built into the culture and everything. So it's not hard to convince them when you offer it to adopt it. You're not going to have to go out on a marketing campaign to say transition. They're going to go there by themselves. So from that first perspective, I would say that's the case. I forget what the second question was.
Are you? Can you? What's your perspective on being able to delete passwords from?
Yeah. So for clients, it's a lot easier, right? Because the systems and all that, really you control the client credential stores at the end of the day. There's certain client credential stores and information that don't have the ability to delete the passwords, but it's easier for clients. Yes, I see. The only way to get there is bring it. So we brought the authentication and fraud closer. The account origination and onboarding is the next phase. That's the key to get this right, because when they are filling out a form to open an account, they should be doing it on a device that you have the ability to do some initial key generations to validate, that then you can leapfrog from. And a lot of these things, we do all this work at the beginning for KYC and account origination, and we don't use it down the stream, right? So, if you do it at the beginning and you onboard them, it's the only way you're going to get away from the initial credentials being set. And that'll save us on the call centers and everything else, because everything falls back that if you don't have a device, fall back to a password. Well, that's not going to work, right? Because that's where we get attacked. So yeah, I think the account origination, KYC initiatives in the beginning, bringing those in. I'm seeing a lot of things in terms of government ID scanners and validators, and with proof of life. They're very good in certain regions geographically around the world. They're getting better, but there's not one that hits every mark. But as you are doing that, you should be thinking about that being your starting point, and then all the clients that have their credentials, you're going to have to figure out how to backtrack them to get rid of the credential, but still have something that if they lose their device or have to reset, that you can rely on.
That makes total sense. Just a shameless plug, we are rolling out certification programs relating to document authenticity and facial
look at that.
selfie matching. So thank you so much, Rakesh and Matt, for a great session. We could keep you here all day, pretty much, if we could, but we're at time at the... Okay.
What happened?
Alan.
I missed something. Yes. Mm-hmm.
We had a presentation from a German issuer that said that a surprising 20% of their users did not have a mobile app and therefore could not authenticate using a mobile app. And so my question is, you have an estimate of, because you have a pretty large base of users, actually, how many will have the adequate mobile app? And for those that do not, what is the alternative for them to go passwordless?
FIDO2, actually. The appless multi-factor authentication with MFA enrollment is based off FIDO2 architecture. So we have that. We talk to our businesses, and a lot of our business do have applications that we can wrap capabilities into. And we get a lot more capabilities in there than just the authentication. We have a lot more signals and all that we can actually put in there with device binding and wrapping and validations. But when the business doesn't have apps, the thing that we are seeing is FIDO2, which is the web authn capabilities with the biometrics, with the private key signing on the device. so that you can do things like a secure link to an SMS and they're opening it up, or a QR code scan and they're performing it within the secure browser based on the FIDO2 protocols.
So I think this is actually really important because the Citibank approach and our joint approach is first doesn't assume a mobile application, a native mobile application on the device, so quote unquote appless, and then there's a set of engineering challenges associated with that, so you can actually reach 100% of your users. And if you and that approach is one of the reasons that Citibank picked a partner.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very good point, and we ran across that, and that's the strategy we're on right now.
All right. Please join me in thanking our fireside chatters.
Thank you. Thank you.